and sin's release us, let us find our rest in thee. Israel, strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art, dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart.
Boring, right? Lists like that can be boring. If somebody says, here's a genealogy, I mean, we turn around and look the other way, pretend we didn't hear. Here's a genealogy. Alexander was the father of James. James, the father of Alexander. Why did they do that, by the way? Alexander, the father of Walter. Walter, the father of Irvin. And Irvin, the father of Charles. Genealogies are pretty boring, right? Unless you know the people. Unless you care about those people. And in this case, in this secondary case, the one that starts with Alexander, Charles, and ends with Charles, Charles is my father. Still smiling despite heavy-duty Alzheimer's at age 96. His father, Irvin, died when I was 2.5. But at least I have a photo of him standing on our back doorstep holding me in his arms. Walter farmed in Musquodoboit in the 1800s. The younger Alexander in my list was a Presbyterian elder for 50 years. James planted elm trees around the church in Onslow. And his father, Alexander, is my great-great-great-great-grandfather, who moved from Londonderry, Ireland, and came to Londonderry, Nova Scotia, coincidence, eh? In 1762. And those names, which mean nothing at all to you, mean a lot to me. Just like the names in your list mean a great deal to you and not much to me. And those first 18 verses of Matthew's gospel are pretty boring unless you care about Jesus. Otherwise, Matthew's record of the genealogy of Jesus is just a list of names from Old Testament history. Boring, boring, boring. And so you and I may be tempted to just skip down to verse 18 where Matthew says, this is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. But that would be to miss something wonderfully important. And so we're not going to jump down to verse 18. We'll pay attention to that next week, and we'll think about the conception and birth of Jesus, tremendously important things to know. Things that increasingly these days, as my talk to the children a few minutes ago proved, increasingly things that even at their most basic level, the what, why, when, who, and where questions, people don't know anymore. We'll talk about that next week. But even Matthew, who wrote all these names down very carefully and crafted them together just right, in fact, crafted them and kind of condensed them so that they would fit in 3 groups of 14 to say, isn't that perfect? Doesn't that look right? Matthew summarizes. He knows that the very human tendency he had and we have, he knows that tendency to jump past the list and get to the meat of the issue. And so he tells us right in the very first sentence, before we have a chance to notice it's a genealogy and to jump down, he tells us the most important thing at the very beginning. And that is that this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's the big summary. That's the big picture story. That's the basic things that a reporter would want to say in the opening lines of her story, the who, what, when, why, etc. of the issue. It's the genealogy of Jesus. That's who it's about. And that's who this book is about. All about. It's a sentence, it's a headline really, that's meant to alert you to the most important thing to say. And that verse, that very first verse of Matthew's Gospel, alerts us to three very important things. The first is that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. The word Christ is not a title, it's not Jesus' last name. It's a Greek word that Matthew has translated from the Hebrew, and the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. The Hebrew word was, or sounded like at least, Messiah. And we've kind of taken it over into English just like that. And the Greeks translated that word as Christ. And they said Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. And what did Messiah mean? Messiah is the word that refers to what the person that the Old Testament was expecting for ages. The one who they hoped for. You know the way that you and I hope for better leaders sometimes? That's what they were doing through those centuries before Christ. They, especially when their secular leaders or their cultural leaders were not performing very well, they hoped for better. Wouldn't it be great if we had somebody better? And the Messiah was the somebody better that they were looking for. The name that they used, well, it meant originally anointed one. They gave that name to their kings and their priests and sometimes with a few others. And over the years and over the centuries, Messiah or Christ became the name to describe the coming king and deliverer that God's people had been hoping for. And Jesus, the one that Matthew's gospel is going to report as born in just a few verses, was that deliverer, that long-awaited one anointed by God who would make a tremendous difference, a life-saving difference. The hopes and fears of all the years, all the centuries, were gathered together in Jesus at Bethlehem that Christmas night. So Jesus is the Messiah. He's also the son of David. The Messiah would be a descendant of David, they believed. Back in 1 Chronicles 17, the Lord made this promise to David: "After you're gone, I will raise up a successor for you, one of your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. And not only that, David, but I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I'll never take my love away from him as I took it away from your predecessor. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever." Wow. Not just, David, don't worry, somebody will succeed you, although God does say that in 1 Chronicles chapter 17, but he also says, and it's going to be an everlasting, it's going to be a forever kind of thing. One way or another, David, I'll make sure that what you hoped for, what you longed for, the kind of leader that you, at your worst moments, wished that you could be, even though David was just an outstanding military leader especially, and worship leader. He had so many things going for him. Despite that, he was so flawed too, like us. And God said, I'll make your leadership prolong into the everlasting future, the forever future. And now in 4 BC, at the date that Matthew was looking back to, God the Father had sent his own son to be legally adopted into David's line. Joseph, a descendant of David, would be the father, humanly speaking. The connection wasn't biological, as Matthew is going to explain to us next week. But Joseph and Mary were legally married, and so Joseph became the adoptive father of Jesus and became the legal heir to Joseph's fortune, whatever that was. Joseph, therefore, became a son of David because Joseph was descended from King David. And finally, in this first verse, Jesus was also the son of Abraham. Abraham, too, had been promised a son way back when. There's one of the Bible studies here at church is looking at that. They're just, as we look through Genesis, we've just come to the point where God has said to Abraham, you know, you're a nobody kind of Abraham, but I love you, and I have a plan for you. And I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And Abraham says, that is just plain ridiculous, Lord, because I don't even have any children. There's not a hope. I'll give you all this land to all your followers. Look up at the sky, see the stars, how many you can't even count them, can you? I'll make your descendants like that. And Abraham says, God, it's stupid, ridiculous. I do not have a kid, and I'm already too old. Just give it up, God. As you and I sometimes say when God challenges us with something awesome that he wants to accomplish through us. Abraham had been promised a son, and God was determined that that son and the descendants of him and the rest would be and would lead to a salvation that would be important. There was going to be a grand plan that would develop out of Abraham's descendants, Abraham's family. The beginning of the rescue plan was to choose Abraham, who would be the father of many nations. He'd be given a son, and through that son, Abraham would have lots of descendants. And the end result, as God had said in Genesis 12, verse 3, would be that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of David. He was the fulfillment of the Jewish hopes. But he was also the son of Abraham, the one through whom the Gentile nations and all the families of the earth, that's us, by the way, in case you missed your part in the story, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And Matthew is going to go on to show that Jesus is welcomed by Joseph and Mary into a Jewish family, yes. Son of David, yes. But he's also welcomed and worshipped by foreigners, the Magi or wise men that Matthew tells us about in chapter 2. You can hear about that on Christmas Eve here at church. Jesus is the King of the Jews and the King of the nations. He's firmly rooted in Israel's history, but he's also the Savior of the world. He is the one for everyone. That means he's the one for you. You might be just starting to turn around in your mind this "who is Jesus" question. You might be just starting to be serious about what it's all about, this Christian faith thing. Jesus is the one. Not just for people way back when, not just for a certain little clique or a group. Jesus is the one for everyone. And that means that Jesus is the one for you. In verses 2 to 16, there are 46 different names, and just let me check to see how many hours I have here. Right. Some of these names are famous, like Isaac and Solomon and Josiah. Never heard of Josiah? Look him up. He's great. He was the revival leader, and a young one at that. Let nobody look down on you because you're a rookie, because you're young. Be a leader like Josiah. Some of them are almost entirely unknown, like Salmon and Azor and Eliud. Who are they? Well, you'll be glad to know that we don't have to turn every page of this detailed family history or look at every person. But did you notice, as I was reading you this list, and you were watching the names go by on the screen, that Matthew added 5 women to this genealogy of Jesus? And that's very unusual, because most genealogies are usually all about men. They're a patriarchal invention. They're part of the oppression. But Matthew is going to break the mold. Matthew is going to do what hopefully you and I will do as well when we write up the notes about our family history. And we'll say what we can know about the great women in our pasts. But for a few minutes this morning, we're going to look at each of these women just for a brief snapshot and then see what they can teach us. The first is Tamar. Verse 3 tells us that one of Joseph's sons, remember Joseph? Judah was his name. He was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, you can read the sordid story of Tamar in Genesis chapter 38. It's about poverty and incest and deception. Not the kind of thing that our kids are likely hearing about in Sunday school right now. But the result of that story, the very intimate result of that story, is a baby who was going to be a great, many times great-grandfather of Jesus. Imagine that. And then in verse 5, there's Rahab. When God's people were poised to cross into the promised land, Rahab, a prostitute, provided the vital information they needed. As a result, Jericho fell to the children of Israel, and Rahab was saved because of a crimson cord hung outside her window. The Jewish spies had told her, "We'll be careful to leave you out of the carnage when we come." And Rahab was saved, both physically and spiritually. And then she married into the line of David and became an ancestor of Jesus and gets mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. Ruth is next mentioned at the end of verse 5. She was a foreigner. In a nation that sometimes prided itself on ethnic purity, Ruth was an outsider. Ruth threw in her lot with her Jewish mother, Naomi. If you were here 2 or 3 months ago, you would have heard this story in greater length. She threw in her lot with Naomi, became part of God's covenant people. Where you go, I go, and your God is going to be my God, Naomi. And she believed in the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, the covenant maker of relationship with God's people. Little did she know that she would become the many times great grandmother of Jesus, and a prominent name in the Messiah's family tree. The fourth woman is Bathsheba, referred to in verse 6. She was Uriah's wife, but King David's adulterous partner. Matthew doesn't even mention her name, oddly. The story is the Old Testament's most scandalous case of seduction. You can read about it in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. Not right now. But when Bathsheba becomes pregnant, David first tries to hide his sin and then doubles down and desperately arranges for Bathsheba's husband Uriah to be killed. He was a general in David's army, and he wrote the orders so that Uriah would almost certainly be doomed. And eventually David's guilt is revealed, and God's judgment falls, as it always does. But Bathsheba eventually became David's wife, and their son Solomon succeeded David as king over Israel. That put Bathsheba in the royal line, and yet another many times great grandmother of King Jesus. That's 4 women. Where's the 5th? The 5th is just at the very end. The 5th is Mary. And we're going to have more to say about her on another day. And every one of these 5 women represents a surprising interruption, an unexpected turn in the march of Israel's history. So says Bible scholar Thomas Long. These 5 women represent a surprising interruption, an unexpected turn in the path of Israel's history. God is in the habit of making surprising interruptions. God is in the habit of not just doing the same old thing. God is in the habit, too, of using flawed people like you and me. God, over and over and over again, works in unusual ways, directing the history of Israel and the history of the church through every difficulty, even the worst situations. God is a specialist at welcoming the foreigners and including the abused and the mistreated, of rescuing notorious sinners and their victims. And the men and women of this list, people like you and me, some of them famous, some of them not. Some of them tragic stories, some of them heroic stories. All of these people were included in the genealogy of Jesus. And in a sense, he kind of gathered them all into one and represented them as he continued on in his life, as he gathered into himself an identification with each one, the sins of everyone, the best interests of everyone. Jesus, the whole picture narrows down to Jesus. The whole Old Testament builds up to this. It's kind of interesting that if you turn back from Matthew chapter 1, you get into Malachi. The whole Old Testament is just right there on Matthew's doorstep. And Matthew summarizes it in half a chapter. Matthew's record of Jesus' ancestors reaches its climax in verse 16. This is my pretty much the last word. Yes, last word. Which carefully records the name of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Messiah. It's a very carefully worded combination of names. Did you notice that Matthew was careful not to call Joseph the father, the biological father of Jesus? He's the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And I don't know about you, but my family tree, despite having those exemplary people that I mentioned to you, my family tree has a few skeletons too, like yours does, right? And sometimes we find ourselves kind of wording the descriptions carefully, like Matthew did in verse 16, in order to not reveal too much, perhaps, but in order to be still true. Well, we're going to look at that rather tangled relationship next week. But Matthew has reached, with the end of this section, Matthew has reached the goal of his genealogy. The goal he told us about right at the very beginning. This is the genealogy of Jesus. And at the end of it he says, thus there were 14 generations from Abraham to David, from David to the exile, and from the exile to the Messiah, Jesus. That's why he told this story. Because it's all about the background of Jesus. You know lots more, perhaps, or at least it's been gathered together for you in a neat little package today. Jesus is the one that we're going to be focusing on this month, in the other Christmas story. in Matthew chapters 1 and 2. Amen.